Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Jeff Wasserstrom. I teach in the history department at UC Irvine, where this event is being hosted in part by the history department. It's also part of the Forum for the Academy and the Public, a campus group launched by Amy Willens, which brings together people and topics from the world of the School of Humanities, the School of Law, and other parts of the campus. And this is also being done in conjunction with the Los Angeles Review of Books. It's my great pleasure to be introducing two friends and people with very interesting things to say about the topics of American politics and the way it's covered. The featured speaker today is Evan Osnos of The New Yorker, who has a new book out, Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. That is to say it's a timely book is an incredible understatement. Evan is known to me and to some of the people I know who are attending, looking at the list of people tuning in, originally for his work on China. He's a New Yorker who wrote about China for The New Yorker, and also had a blog back when blogs were quite new, and he had a wonderful letter from China blog. And he wrote the book Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. And that was his first book, and now he's pivoted to being back in the United States and covering American politics, again for The New Yorker, and now he's also going to be a contributor on CNN. So he will be in dialogue here with Allison Perlman, a colleague of mine from the history department, who's also in the film and media studies department. She's an associate professor in both of those places. She's the author of Public Interests, Media Advocacy and Struggles Over US Television, which was published a few years ago by Rutgers. And the idea for this launch event came partly, and we think it's the first one that Evan has done, speaking to a university group as opposed to at bookstores and so forth. And it's linked to a class that Allison has been teaching on media and the US elections. So if you want to ask questions, please put them in the Q&A section if you're watching this via Zoom, or you can do it through the Facebook live stream via chat there. So I'm just really looking forward to hearing how these two people who I enjoy so much talking to in private will be talking about this in public. So over to you, Allison.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And Evan, thank you so much for being here today. And on behalf of History 144G, we're really thrilled to be able to talk with you. I was hoping to begin actually with the beginning of your book, in which you relay an anecdote about Joe Biden that I actually had never heard before. And so I was wondering if you would mind just sharing that anecdote and then talking briefly about why you decided to begin your story of Joe Biden with it.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. It's fun to join you on here, and thanks to Jeff for putting us together. You know, my only regret, of course, is that I'm not there in person in the gorgeous campus under the sunshine as I have been in the past when I've come to Irvine. So I hope to have a chance to do that again in the future. You know, I started this book with, exactly as you said, a story that in some ways I think a lot of us don't know, but is in fact quite instructive about Joe Biden's life. That's the story of the day that he woke up in 1988 and he couldn't move his legs and he was lying on the floor of a hotel room and he didn't know how he got there. And what had happened, of course, was that he had suffered 2 catastrophic brain aneurysms, and his assistant was able to get him off to the hospital back in Delaware, got him on a plane, got him to the hospital. And the surgeon said it was so dire that they actually called in a priest to deliver last rites. And he went under the knife and they put him back together, and he made a full recovery. He was out of the Senate for 7 months. He was flat on his back for 3 months. And there's a couple of interesting moments in there that I think tell us something. One is that this was happening, you'll remember, right after he had dropped out of the presidential race in 1987, when he'd been accused of plagiarism, and it had just sort of ended in disaster. And one of the surgeons said to him, you know, you're a very lucky man. And he said, how in God's name am I a lucky man? I mean, I've just here, you know, pushed to the brink of death. And he said, well, if you had still been in that presidential race, hoofing it around New Hampshire, you might have neglected symptoms and you might not be here at all. And when Biden then went back to the Senate and he gave his first speech, he said to people, I feel like I'm living a second life. This is a new lease on life. And there's actually a pattern in that story that I think becomes telling to us about his whole life, which is that he has had these moments of almost kind of extraordinary cruelty happen to him, and then also moments of unbelievable good fortune. And we can talk about some of those. But it was, in fact, his friend, Ted Kaufman, his advisor, longtime chief of staff back in the Senate days, who said to me a few years ago the line that inspired really me to sort of begin to think about writing about Biden at greater length, which was, he said to me, if you ask me the luckiest person I know, I'll tell you it's Joe Biden. If you ask me the unluckiest person I know, it's Joe Biden. And there's a big story in there, I think.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think this binary between Joe Biden being someone who's been on the receiving end of really like horrific sadness and tragedy in his life, but also maybe stumbling into victories is one of the key through lines that you trace. One of the other through lines that I would love to hear you talk about is you present Biden as someone who is defined by a commitment to respect and dignity of all people, who's someone who suffered a great deal and so has this really tremendous capacity for empathy, and is someone who's always seeking consensus or compromise. From your book, those are sort of the three main traits that I took away about Biden. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see his political convictions, or how we ought to think of him as a political leader. And is he primarily defined by these personal traits, or in the course of studying his career, do you see consistent political commitments, consistent ideas about the role of government? Just what kind of, I guess, where do you see his political convictions beyond these personal attributes?
It's a really interesting question, because like a lot of things in a political life, in some ways, the things that are his strengths are also his liabilities. And I think reasons for criticism, legitimate criticism. And we can sort of talk about some of that. I mean, one of the things that when we think about Joe Biden's political convictions, one of the things people will sometimes say is, hold on a second. This is a guy who has been all over the map in his career politically. I mean, he has been, he was for many years an opponent of federal support for abortion services. Then later he changed his position on that. He has been somebody who obviously in the 70s, as we remember, he was really the Democratic Party's most strident opponent of court-ordered busing. And then, of course, later in his career ended up becoming the vice president to the first Black president, and sort of began to see himself as somebody who he liked to believe was an agent of pushing history forward on matters of race. And so you see sometimes these real cross currents. And I think one of the things that gives people pause about him is they say, how can you be all of those things at once? Do you stand for something? Mm-hmm. And, I will tell you, in the early part of his career, at the very beginning, the real criticism of him when he got to the Senate was that he was callow, that he didn't have these kinds of animating ideas. People would say, why did you run for the Senate other than the fact that you're a pretty good talker and people seem to like you out on the stump? What do you want to achieve? And interestingly, when you go back and you look at his comments from that period, 1973, shortly after he got into Congress, he actually sort of kind of owns up to the fact that he didn't really have some big ideas. What he said at one point to an interviewer back then was, I think campaigns are more about presentation and about personality than they are about the underlying issues. And, to be blunt, that's not the kind of language that we hope to hear from moral heroes. I mean, that's not how we think of sort of the people who are leading us forward to be our better selves, and so on. And I think one of the things that is important is the way that his personal life and the sheer span and depth of his personal experience, both the highs and the lows. And they're not all just tragedies of fate. These are also his own mistakes and screw-ups along the way. That it's that combination that has given him, it sort of delivered to him the reason for politics that he may not have had at the outset. And what I think you come to today, when you get to, here it is now, 48 years after he first came to Congress, you get a person who really does have convictions about what he's doing. And what that is, if I had to boil it down, what I would say is he believes fundamentally in the idea that government properly administered and properly organized can make you a little safer and probably a little healthier. And there's a certain level of, that by itself constitutes a radical statement in this day and age in which we have this kind of, weaponized anti-government sentiment. And, but he comes from a basic belief that if you do things right, if you treat government as a practice, as something that's dignifying, that you might be able to help people. And that actually, curiously enough, is one of the things that drew him together with Barack Obama, because after all, they are so completely different. And then I will stop this monologue in a second, but I think it's an interesting point, because we think of President Obama as somebody, it'd be much easier for you and I, Allison, to say, okay, here are his political convictions. We could probably itemize them cleanly. We could say that he believes in the idea of a multi-ethnic democracy, that he believes in the idea of a country with an activist government that is in fact protecting the most vulnerable. And even though Biden has not put that at the center of his politics, they saw that in one another in 2008. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why Obama said, this is somebody I can work with, even though we are so different.
Thank you for that. I mean, that actually leads to another question that I had and that a number of my students had, including Josie and Michael and Connor and David, which is about Biden's relationship to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And I think one of the things that you do so beautifully in the book is discuss as a nominee in the Democratic primaries, Biden was very careful not to demonize his opponents. And once he secured the nomination, he created a big tent where he brought in people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and AOC to help him shape his policies. And so I think we're curious how you understand both Biden's relationship to the progressive wing of the party now that he's in office or is about to be in office as president, and what you more broadly understand to be the future of the party, given this real schism that we're seeing between perhaps a younger, more progressive wing and the Biden boomer generation of centrists, or as you note in your book, marching the party towards a more rightward trajectory since Biden took office?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I mean, that is the core challenge facing the party and facing his administration, is how do you encompass the beliefs, the urgency, the anxiety of this really broad party. It encompasses everything from, we call Biden a boomer. He's not even a boomer. He's actually the silent generation. He comes before the boomers. And what's fascinating is that in some ways, it was Biden's recognition of where the party is now that allowed him to get where he is. But in order to succeed, he has to recognize where it's going. So where is it now? Well, interestingly, I think of the key piece of data that is part of the reason why he's in the position he's in now is that he said over and over again, internally, this is sort of the thing that he would say, with his team, that if you look at what Democrats say in 2020 or 2019, when he got into this race, most of them, a majority of Democrats, still describe themselves as moderate or conservative Democrats. And most of them are over the age of 50. And so even though many of us, meaning political observers, people who are interested in politics, certainly people in the press. We pay a lot of attention to the progressive frontier of the party, but it's not in fact where the main ballast of the electorate was. So that's how you had a man who was, after all, a white man in his 8th decade, entered this race. He was the most conservative, arguably, of the 20 some odd candidates, and yet he was the one who was the last man standing. And I think that was deflating for a lot of younger Democrats, certainly, because they said, hold on, this was the most diverse field we've ever had, and we got this guy. And what they also had to appreciate in the end, I think this is what you saw on election day, was the recognition that, sorry, this is a country that is very much still, it is still defined by elements that are, it is less diverse than where the frontier of the party is. It is older, and it's going to get there, but it's not there yet. And so that, in a way, was his core insight, was the future of the party may be AOC. In fact, it probably will be some version of that, but it's not in 2020. And if we think it is in 2020, we're probably going to lose to Donald Trump. So now the challenge is, and you saw, 70 million Americans still cast votes for Donald Trump. Now the question is is he nimble enough and self-aware enough to recognize that the party in even 2 years from now is going to be more progressive than it was on first day of November in 2020. And that's going to be harder, because when you get into the presidency, all of the pressures around you more or less tell you to believe your own instincts, because you were right after all, you got there. And now you have to get up every day and say, okay, what am I right about, and what do I need to adapt? And if he doesn't adapt, he will find himself out of step with the party. I had an interesting conversation with President Obama about this question, actually, over the summer in preparation as I was writing the book. And I said, how do you think the left end of the party is going to deal with a President Biden? And he said, I think they're going to start hammering him right away. And so they should, because that's how the Democratic Party works. We are a big tent party. And they should push him. Now, it's also true, though, that what I hope, and this is him talking, I'm paraphrasing, is that I hope that they don't chuck him overboard at the first sign that he's not completely ideological, a complete fellow traveler. Like, that's not how we're going to make things happen in this country. And that I think is the sweet spot. The really interesting area is between where progressives will say we need to push this presidency, and the point at which they say he's not our man, and become and seek to actually undermine his politics. That's I think the ball game.
Yeah, well, could we talk a little bit about maybe the other side of the ball game, which is Biden's potential relationship with the Republican Party moving forward? Because I think one of the things that and I think most of us who followed the Obama years observed, is that Obama himself seemed to have maybe too much confidence in his own ability to bridge the divide with Republicans, to find consensus, to be this unifier. And really the first years of his presidency seemed marred by this belief in a Republican Party that didn't really exist anymore. And I was curious about how you understand Biden and his understanding of his own capacity, based on having been elected to the Senate in 1972 and governed for so many decades and built relationships with Republicans, if he too believes himself to be this figure who can unite not just the Democratic Party, but a profoundly polarized nation, and work with a Republican Party who's been profoundly intransigent for over a decade.
That is, I think, unfortunately, he does see himself that way. Now, I say this with respect, because the truth is, I think that there are ways in which that belief can be helpful to him, and then there is a point at which it can become unhelpful. So the way it's helpful is that he goes into this process with a fundamental assumption that it's not impossible. And that's actually meaningful. I mean, that's a big deal. To go to this question of, what brought Obama and Biden together, part of it was that they really do have this belief that you can find a negotiated middle somewhere even among warring parties. They do it very differently. Obama does it by the sheer power of his language and by the sort of force of his own experience and the clarity of his persuasion. Biden is different. Biden is a backslapper and a glad hander, as we know. He'll go in and he'll negotiate. As long as a person wants to talk, he'll talk. But what they fundamentally believe is that it's possible. Now, the challenge for him is that the Republican Party is now even more entrenched against Democrats succeeding than they were 12 years ago. And when I spoke to President Obama about it, he said, I think it has been painful for Joe, that was his word, painful for Joe to come to terms with how truly hostile and dysfunctional that side of the aisle has become. Now, he and McConnell do have a relationship, and that is not immaterial here. I mean, McConnell was the only Republican senator to attend Beau Biden's funeral in 2015. He's also, you remember the two of them at this moment of kind of total partisan breakdown in 2011, 2012, right around the fiscal cliff crisis. The White House had been unable to make a deal with Republicans, and McConnell called over to the West Wing, called Biden's office and said, is there anybody over there who knows how to make a deal? And the two of them ended up hashing something out. And it made a lot of Democrats unhappy. They thought that he gave away too much, but he did find something. He made a deal and was able to avert what was a kind of generated crisis. I think what you're likely to see today, and I think this is where I find that I'm sort of often reminded of myself as I go back and, when I talk to the president-elect about politics and when I look at his record over the years, I am reminded that he didn't get here by accident. The guy has real political nerve endings. He can sense when there is, to use the term that he loves more than any other, when there is deal space and when there is not, when it's possible to do something and when it's really not. And he is not going to sit there with his hand extended if nobody is going to shake it. And, as one of his advisors put it to me not long ago, it's not a mystery here what Plan B is. Plan B is scorched earth. We will use what we can within the executive branch to get our things done. But that's a difference from walking in the door with the announcement that you believe it's impossible. And you will not see Biden do that. He is going to proceed on the track that it is possible, and he's going to make Republicans disappoint him before he gives up.
So one of the questions that we have from the audience that is also from one of my students, Amanda, is about political polarization and the degree to which you see social media as a pivotal instrument in exacerbating the escalating amount of political polarization that we see right now. And so if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit about how you see the role of digital media and especially social media in our political moment, but especially in these high rates of political polarization.
I think there is no question that it is an important ingredient in the process. Look, a lot of friends of mine who work at technology companies will say, hold on a second, polarization existed before us and you can't blame us for having created the conditions that we're now seeing. Technology is only a magnifier of things that are already happening in American society, good and bad. And I find that to be a totally unpersuasive defense, because the truth is magnification is a really powerful force. And particularly when something is optimized and as powerful as Twitter or Facebook is. And I come to this question partly with having spent some time thinking a lot about this. I did a profile of Mark Zuckerberg a couple of years ago and sort of spent a number of months working on these questions about how does the leadership in Silicon Valley think about their political responsibility, their obligations, their role in a political community. And I came away to boil, a 15,000 word story into 2 sentences. What I would say is I came away with the sense that they were in many ways politically naive and sort of immature about the role that they would play. I say that, with a clean heart. I think that they were astonished to discover just how transformative their power really was. And then they raced to try to figure out how to mitigate the harm. And they haven't fully succeeded, partly because mitigating the harm of social media runs truly contrary to the business model. And as long as that's the case, it's going to be very hard to get that under control. So I think what you saw in this election was that obviously before election day, you saw this very aggressive and I think largely successful effort. We'll wait until scholars do the hard work of going through and really figuring out what happened and what didn't happen. But by and large, we did not see before election day this kind of some of the more grotesque forms of disinformation that were dragging people apart. Now, after election day, it got more complicated because you had a president who was using his platform, and it's a unique platform because the social media companies, they say that the president gets more latitude than other ordinary users, and that he was using that platform to prosecute a fantasy about overturning the results of the election. And in that moment, they found themselves, I think, a little bit more in a muddled place. So long story short, really, I mean, the question that was asked was about polarization. What I would say is there's just no question in my mind that the instruments of digital culture are driving us into further disagreement. And this happens to be on my mind. I'm writing at the moment a thing about some of the ways in which the technology broadly defined, and by that I mean digital technology, but also political technology, things like the invention of the super PAC, things like the post-Citizens United campaign finance. All of these are technologies of a certain kind, and that all of them are optimized in some way to polarize us. And I think it's what we're living through right now is not a period in which we're inventing these new sensations and new values and new societal phenomena. We've always had things like segregation and seclusion, and we've always had greed in some form or another. But what we've done is we've created these tools that optimize all of those things. It makes us more segregated within our own ideological worlds. It makes us more capable of driving one another apart. And that is how I think of technology in the context of politics.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we had been thinking about towards the end of our quarter was both the way that social media can foment, echo chambers or informational silos or filter bubbles, however you want to phrase it, but also, and I think we're seeing this right now, can create a real epistemic divide where people are in disagreement, not just over political opinion or interpretation of events, but actually over what are, like, factually, how do we know what we know? Who do we trust to convey to us what's happening in the world? Who won an election? Is a virus serious? Will a vaccine work? And that this seems, to me at least, to be a variation on, but a really dangerous variation on what we've seen as the escalation of partisan media, right? Where we're not just disagreeing on why did Biden beat Trump, but we're actually disagreeing about whether Biden beat Trump. And so you present Biden as someone who is such a retail politician, right? He came up shaking hands and kissing babies, and not as someone who's necessarily technologically savvy, or his campaign didn't really use the tools of social media nearly to the degree that his opponent did. So how do you think a Biden administration is going to contend with really what strikes me as a profound crisis for democratic processes, that we don't have a citizenry with a shared sense of just facts on the ground?
It is precisely as you describe. I think you put it so well. It is a sort of crisis of epistemology more than just technology or politics or polarization. It gets to the very basis of what the Enlightenment was supposed to deliver to us, which is the idea that we can reason our way towards a mutually agreed upon truth. And I think in some ways we are, when I think about the causes of it, it is as much to do with the underlying economic issues in this country as it is to do with the technological instruments, by which I mean specifically, I spend a lot of time in West Virginia. It's a place that I worked when I first got out of college. And one of the things that's striking to me is that people in West Virginia have a lot of contempt for expertise and for experts and for the elites that they associate with that, partly because they look at their conditions in their lives and they are frustrated that that expertise has not done more for them. And they see that it is in fact delivering all of this bounty into the hands of a few. So I think it's hard to sort of disaggregate it completely from things like income inequality and the sort of profound structural disadvantages and advantages that we have. Now, I would say, I think Biden is funny because he came into this moment kind of gleefully disarmed in the era of social media. He really believed, and his campaign was adamant, that they needed to use Ron Klain's expression, ignore the noise. This is an expression that he began using during the Ebola crisis when he was the Ebola czar in the White House, where he said, look, we need to screen out all of this fear and anxiety that's floating around, particularly online, about Ebola. Let's focus on what we need to do. Focus on the science, focus on the facts. That's what's going to lead us out of the woods here. And they were largely right. And then you saw this in the campaign too, as one of his campaign advisors said to me, we're not going to spend every day fighting a Twitter war. Now, the problem of that, of course, is that only works up to a point. But if there are huge numbers of Americans, and it seems to us today that there are literally tens of millions of Americans who believe, for instance, that Donald Trump won this election, how do you begin to get them back into the land of recognizable reality? Mm-hmm. That is a forbidding challenge. I think it is about more than just what a president can do and what an administration can do. I think it kind of begins to get into a whole of society problem and a whole of society's solution, in the sense that it does matter what Mark Zuckerberg thinks his role is. And it does matter what Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan thinks his role is. And it does, and you can go down that list. I think these pieces are, at the risk of making the problem sound too forbiddingly vast, they are interconnected. And putting like warning labels on Trump's tweets is not going to solve the reason, is not going to address the fact that tens of millions of Americans are even willing to engage in the fantasy that what he's saying is true. And that worries me. I will say one thing, though, is that what I've been struck by is Biden's genuine belief, and I think it's quite persuasive, that the words of a president matter. And in the same way that we've seen over the last 4 years that a fantasist and a fabulist in the White House, somebody who is actively doing violence to the facts, that really does have an effect on people. That somebody who comes in with a very different attitude and says, no, I believe in science, I believe in verifiable fact, that too can have a positive effect. And it doesn't solve the problem, but it begins to point us in the right direction. And I'm struck by how much that idea was in fact a key part of Joe Biden getting into this campaign at all, was his really deep belief that Donald Trump's hostility to truth was a threat to the future of American democracy.
There's a question in the Q&A that from Michael that I'm going to just rephrase a little bit. But he's asking in part about the Merrick Garland Supreme Court seat, but more broadly about Republican malfeasance, even before Trump was elected. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how does Biden both address what many of us see as stolen Supreme Court seats, or just an intransigent, immoral Republican-led Senate moving forward, and while still, as you're noting, try to at least initially extend an olive branch to the Republican Party and try to work with them before they prove themselves not to be. So it's both a question about how do you move forward working with Republicans while also not excusing or condoning these past actions.
What's interesting to me is that Biden's basic belief about politics hinges on the power of interests. So always understanding what a person's interests are, whether they are a foreign head of state that you're negotiating with, or they are an individual voter who you're talking to in a rope line in Pennsylvania. His really core assumption is, don't go into the encounter assuming that the other person is an idiot. That's his term. That's by the way Biden put it to me. And I think there's a sort of deep lesson in that, which I took, it's quite meaningful, which is to say, he doesn't believe that he is going to go in and be able to suddenly change the moral character of large numbers of Congress who just went along, in effect, with a kind of attempted coup. That he's not going to pretend that's the case. What he's going to try to do is recognize, what are their interests? Like, what are they actually trying to do here? Is it simply about keeping themselves in office? If that's the case, that's certainly the case for some of them. Is it also possible that there are other things at play here? When it comes to the voters, his real belief is, and I think I find this credible, that a lot of politics and loyalty comes down to a non-empirical measure that we would simply call, is this guy on my side? I mean, in the end, does this person fundamentally have the remotest interest in my livelihood and my future and my success? And in a way that I think a lot of us find baffling, a lot of Americans did see that in Donald Trump. I mean, they just, for whatever reason, they looked at this guy and they said, I mean, and it's an ugly fact. Some of them said, look, he's on my side because he shares my racial anxieties. Some of them said he's on my side because he shares my conception of this kind of boogeyman fear of China. He's on my side for all kinds of reasons. Biden's belief is that if he can make a case to people that he's on their side for other reasons, not those ones, but because he wants, for instance, to make sure that if their parent or their child gets sick, that they might be able to get treated. That if he believes, that he might be on their side by sheer virtue of the fact that he is taking COVID seriously enough that he wants to try to protect them against it. All of those kinds of things, it's amazing how much Donald Trump was able to do just by standing at a podium and opening his mouth. And I think it's in Joe Biden's belief is, let's see what we can do simply by operating government with the assumption that we are going to treat Americans with dignity and see if we can get somewhere with that. You're not going to win everybody over, but I think you might be surprised about how much people are open to the idea of it. That's the best you can hope for. And it's not, it doesn't change the fact that Merrick Garland had a seat stolen right out from under him. But I think part of what Biden's trying to do, and this gets to the questioner's really good question, is we're trying to now separate how much is this about, how much should we be seeking accountability and how much should we be seeking revenge? Those are different facts and they're different processes. And I think what we might find is accountability is one thing, but revenge may do us more harm than it does us good, I think.
Yeah, on that note, we have a question from Stephen about Biden's Catholic faith and how you understand his faith structuring his morality, his view of the world, and especially how you might imagine Biden as a Catholic addressing people of faith in the nation, especially given the fact that members of the evangelical community have been so firmly supportive of President Trump and the Republican Party. And do you imagine there might be some sort of realignment given that Biden has been so explicit about being a person of faith?
The truth is, I don't think there is likely to be a big realignment. I think that a lot of these questions of kinship are only partly about announced faith and about real belief. I mean, I'm going to boldly go out on a limb here and say that Donald Trump is not all that much of a Christian, and yet he has had this extraordinary level of support from the evangelical community. And Biden is in a different place. I mean, Biden is quite a devout man. I mean, it's worth reminding ourselves of that. I mean, it runs deep with him. And you heard recently when he was giving his victory speech, he's quoting Ecclesiastes. He's quoting the idea that there is a season. And this runs through everything that he believes about himself and about how society is organized. He doesn't tend to bring his politics into, he doesn't bring his faith into politics as much as you might expect for somebody who is in fact so close to the church. I mean, he wears it quite differently. He doesn't sort of wield it the way that some folks in Washington do, like Mike Pence and so on. I think what you're likely to see is that Biden will actually probably, I think Biden's is probably not going to try to make too much of an explicit appeal on behalf of his own faith as a way of saying to people, I'm your guy. It's just a hunch. I haven't talked to him about it that much. What I have talked to him about when it comes to his faith is that he is open about the ways in which it has been helpful for him at times. And then there are moments when it has also, from his perspective, failed him. I mean, when his wife and his daughter died, as he said, nothing in the teachings of Christ had prepared me for that. And I found nothing in it. And so, he comes to it with a sincerity that I suspect will resonate with some people. But honestly, I'm not expecting that it's going to have a transformative effect on the politics of faith, because I think those have much more to do with actual political, with the sort of, the political landscape, issues like abortion, for instance, than it does with the depth of his own belief.
So we have a question about the way that you imagine Biden will handle his foreign policy. And you're welcome to talk about that in any way you like, but specifically if you have thoughts about Biden's China policy and the degree to which it may or may not deviate from Obama's China policy.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a fair bit about it. I've talked to him about it. It's kind of interesting, I think, to go through what I think are the key priorities. The number one thing that he believes the United States has to do before it can do anything else is COVID. And that is both a domestic and a foreign policy issue. It's a foreign policy issue in the sense that you cannot begin to restore America's credibility around the world while we are failing to stem the epidemic. It's just a fact that every day we are projecting incompetence rather than projecting what we want to do, which is show the rest of the world that we are reliable, capable, adept partners. And but the second piece of that is about beginning to go out in the world and say to people, look, we understand that you just lost a lot of confidence in us over the last 4 years, but we're here. It's still us. We're back. We ejected that guy, which we don't do very often after 4 years. He's done. And his belief was if we elected Donald Trump for another 4 years, that the world may never forgive us. And we didn't do that. And so that's part of his claim. And you've heard him talk about the idea of creating a kind of caucus of democracies that can provide a form to this new period. And that, I think, brings me to the other key point, which is the world has changed dramatically since he left office in January 2017. And you hear that very clearly from some of his advisors, particularly Jake Sullivan. I think folks who are interested in trying to understand how does the Biden crowd see a changed world, read some of the things Jake's been writing over the last couple of years, some of the interviews he's given. I've talked to him enough to have a feel for, he really does think that the way that they approach China, for instance, is defunct, that idea cannot work anymore, that you cannot go into this assuming that China is what you might call a kind of restless cooperative agent, that you have to approach it as a fundamentally competitive process. But that's different than what the Trump administration has done. So that, to be clear about what I think they'll do on China, I think what they will do is borrow some of the leverage that the Trump administration leaves behind. They've put in place this tariff regime, which the Biden transition and the administration would never have put in themselves, but they're not going to remove it right away. What they're going to do is raise the price. They're going to say, hold on a second, we're going to get rid of this only if you do really substantive reforms on things that we genuinely care about, like intellectual property, like market access. Whether or not they extend that to national security issues, we'll see. But they've been given in a perverse way, they've been given a bit of a parting gift by the Trump administration. Now, they do regard the Trump administration's handling of China as chaotic and sort of untutored and frankly kind of self-destructive, just in this basic fact that Americans were paying these tariffs and Trump was pretending they weren't. But they will take the few little pieces of that regime and they will make use of them, I think. So if I was in China's shoes, there's a reason why China was very slow to congratulate Joe Biden winning the election. It was very slow to sort of part with the idea of the end of the Trump presidency, because I think they're very sorry to see the Trump presidency go. It has turned out to be quite an astonishing gift strategically. And they recognize that a Biden administration is likely to be a little more difficult to deal with.
We have a question from Sydney about Joe Biden's victory this past November. And I know it just happened, but she's curious about your thoughts on the reasons for the victory. We often tend to look at messaging or media strategy, but obviously, of course, this election took place against the backdrop of the pandemic and against the backdrop of tremendous protests over the course of the summer, instigated by the murder of George Floyd, that really brought the movement for Black lives into the center of American political discourse. And so could you just reflect a little bit about how you understand this victory and the degree to which it was the Biden campaign or the broader historical context in which the election took place that might be responsible for the victory?
So really interesting, and you know there will be a shelf of literature behind me, I'm supposed to, to answer those kinds of questions with the sort of humility of saying that this is the rough draft moment. What I think are a couple of things we know. One is that, and I think Joe Biden would acknowledge this, he probably wouldn't be president today had it not been for a combination of factors. It was an extraordinary confluence of events. I mean, even down to the fact that the virtual campaign meant that he was not out on the road all the time, and so it meant that he was probably a little bit, he was probably made a few, fewer mistakes than he might have, and those kinds of things. It's also true, though, that in some ways Joe Biden was the right man for 2020, and in some ways he found himself out of step. I mean, he was not the most progressive candidate. He was not by any means the candidate, particularly that young activists in the Black Lives Matter movement would have chosen. What you find is, like, as in anywhere in society, that there are generational differences, and that in South Carolina, which was so essential to Joe Biden becoming the nominee and eventually becoming the president, it was really older African-American voters who delivered it for him. And I had an interesting conversation with Jim Clyburn, the great congressman from South Carolina, who was the decisive endorsement. And Jim Clyburn said, look, I get a lot of criticism from younger African-American activists. He, after all, was somebody who's been in the civil rights movement for half a century. And he now says, I get it. I understand why they are frustrated with me. Because he calls himself a centrist. And that can sound like he's not really all that interested in moving fast enough. His view is that politics will swing from the extreme to the extreme. And what that means, as he said, is that it passes through the center twice as often as it goes to the extremes. And he said, that's why I'm a centrist. That's what I think is the essential American character. And that's basically how Biden sees it too. So when Clyburn expresses that idea, he's giving you an insight into Biden's view. The truth is, I think Biden in some ways was not quite ready to understand the depth of the demands that were coming for changes in American policing. And he did what he tried to catch up to it, and he probably caught up to it enough in order to maintain the support of enough voters. But we know there are a lot of voters who felt like he didn't fundamentally get it, and he was not their guy. And I think part of the challenge for him will be to continue to evolve in office and to recognize, okay, now what do we do? Community policing is not the answer. That's one of the things that he has said is we need to put more money into community policing. It's an idea that has essentially been kind of left by the side of the scholarly road. It's not the cutting edge, state of the art thinking. And he needs to make sure that he is getting some of that if he wants to try to build that coalition for 4 years from now.
So we have a question from Caitlin about your most recent piece in the New Yorker, where you offer this really, I would say, jarring history of two parallel tracks in US political history, one in which Americans engage in rational debate and come together to try to seek solutions to common problems, and then one that's marred by political violence, right? So we have the Lincoln-Douglas debates, as you note, followed by the Civil War. And the piece ends with your urging us to develop, in some ways, all of us as citizens, different habits to avoid the destructive politics of political violence and to move ourselves back more towards this terrain of rational debate. And so Caitlin is actually wondering if you could be a little bit more concrete about how do we engender different kinds of political habits amongst the citizenry to assure a safe and productive political future.
Yeah, it's, this piece was an attempt to reckon with these two powerful strains in our political culture. On the one hand, we really are the children of the Enlightenment, a country that was founded, to use Ben Franklin's term, in reason's eye. The idea that we were not going to be a culture that was seeking to achieve, what the deities and the kings wanted us to. We were going to be loyal to the facts and to reason. And at the same time, what we also know is that from the very moment of inception, our country has had a history of political brutality. Some of it physical violence, a lot of it has been, and some of it also sort of violence of language. In the piece, I went through some of the ways in which people like Richard Hofstadter, who are we think of as some of the great political analysts of our culture, they began at the end of his life, shortly before he died, he was looking at this question of violence and why is it such a part of our lives? I come to the end to thinking there's two things that are important. One is, in some ways, one is the easy one, but is difficult politically, which is that it is just sheer lunacy that we are a country with more guns than people. And it is uniquely crazy. I say this as somebody who works around the world, and it is our distinguishing feature among advanced democracies, and it makes no sense. So that is also an issue on which most Americans believe there are reasonable ways we could begin to get our gun culture under control. So that's one thing. The other thing is the harder one. And, it seems amazing to think of something harder than achieving real gun reform, but it is the harder one. And that is the process of beginning to restore the idea of putting ourselves into nonviolent contact with hostile ideas. I included a fact in that part of the piece that I think is kind of the sort of fact that is worth carrying around in your mind, which is that there are more libraries in America than there are Starbucks in America. We have a civic infrastructure to put ourselves into confrontation with people we don't agree with, and to have it be safe, and to have it be productive. I don't mean physically that it's libraries. It might be. Actually, libraries really are kind of an amazing feature of the democratic culture. But what it really is about is putting ourselves into spaces in which we are uncomfortable, in which we are willing to acknowledge that another person has a valid idea. They may not agree with me, and I might not agree with them. But let's just begin to actually sort of permit the idea that in our seclusion, we're not making ourselves stronger. We may be, in fact, be making ourselves making ourselves weaker. So if anybody's interested in that particular topic, I would commend to you this really terrific report that was done by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It was led by Danielle Allen at Harvard, who is thinking in all kinds of really creative ways about what are the practical, concrete steps you can do to try to revive political culture and discourse. And some of them are not quite as hard as you might think. There is a body of thinking out there that's doing it. And that gives me real optimism.
Great. Well, let's end on a note of optimism then. So thank you so much for just your generosity and this really wonderful conversation. We're so happy and appreciative to have you here.
Thanks, Allison. That was a lot of fun. It's great to be with you.
Thank you all. This was a wonderful conversation, and I love the way it ended, not just for the optimism, but also before live visits had stopped being something we could think about. We were in dialogue with the Newport Beach Public Library about bringing Evan out for a live event. He's done an event for the library there. So to link this up to the libraries is a perfect way, and also allows me to mention, since I think absolutely correctly in saying that even with international subjects, you can't separate them from the domestic subjects, that we've been having an ongoing series that has been looking at how views of the United States have been changing in different parts of the world. And so here, this event, as different as it was, with a journalist in America thinking globally, will be followed up with events with journalists and other writers in other parts of the world that will continue in a series, Who Do They Think We Are?, about changing views of the United States. We did a couple of these in the fall, and then in January, we're going to do one January 12th featuring Pankaj Mishra, a writer who's dealt with many parts of the world and is now living in London and spends a lot of time in India. And then later in January, we'll be doing an event with a couple of writers in Moscow, including, continuing a theme, a New Yorker writer there. So I hope you can tune into those. And I just want to thank all of you who attended, and especially Allison for the superb moderating, and Evan for the generosity of your time to come here and visit us. Next time in person.
Here, here. Great to be with you guys.